In one of his earliest videos, YouTuber Preston Jacobs puts forth a bold reinterpretation of a scene that we're all very familiar with from the book Game of Thrones. This is the pivotal moment of Eddard's justice against Gregor Clegane, the Mountain that Rides, and I'm sure for many it marks the true start of the War of the Five Kings. However, have we analyzed this entire incident wrong? Have we been assigning blame to Tywin Lannister when he may in fact be innocent of these crimes? Is everything truly as it seems in the court of Robert Baratheon on the day that the River Lords come to petition Eddard Stark for leave to go to war? Well, we're going to examine this nearly 8-year-old question raised by Preston Jacobs, in the hopes to answer this potential Riverlands mystery. And I will offer you a reinterpretation of what up until this point has been seen as a relatively clear-cut case. And so, without further ado, let us journey into the Riverlands of the Finger. Preston Jacobs makes several astute observations in his video, and then proceeds to go rather hard in the paint on some obviously ravaged peasants. In ones and twos, the holdfast of Sharer struggled to its feet. One ancient needed to be helped, and a young girl in a bloody dress stayed on her knees.
Sir Raymond Derry brought a bunch of lying peasants in front of Eddard and started a war between the Starks and the Lannisters.
At Windishtown, the people sought shelter in their holdfast, but the walls were timbered. The raiders piled straw against the wood and burnt them all alive. When the Windish folk opened their gates to flee the fire, they were shot down with arrows as they came running out, even women with suckling babes.
Wow, Sir Raymond, that's a lot of details considering no one survived Windishtown to tell that story.
They would have done the same for us, but Shrer's holdfast made of stone. Some wanted to smoke us out, but the big one said there was riper fruit upriver, and they made for the Mummer's Ford.
That's some super hearing you got there, Joss, considering you were inside a stone holdfast.
And while I think Preston's interpretations of the peasant's testimony is less than charitable, I do think he's focusing in on a critical problem with this situation. Because the raids in the Riverlands do come off a little confusing. Now, Preston very rapidly addresses Harwin's whack-ass story about why the mountain was sent by Tywin, which, again, doesn't really make any sense at all.
But what about Harwin's story? Yeah, what about Harwin's story? In A Storm of Swords, Harwin tries to explain all of this madness. He says Lord Tywin sent his mountain across the Red Fork with fire and sword, hoping to draw out Eddard. He planned for Eddard to come west himself to deal with the mountain. If he had, he would have been killed or taken prisoner and traded for the imp. So Harwin is reading Tywin's diary now? I'm not sure how he's coming upon this information. But this supposed plan doesn't make any sense. It relies on Robert to be out hunting so that Eddard will be handling the kingdom's business alone. But Robert only goes out hunting after Eddard gets injured. Had Tywin heard about Robert's hunting trip, he would have heard about Eddard's injury and known that Eddard couldn't deliver justice himself. If Tywin were ignorant of Eddard's injury, he would also be ignorant of Robert's hunting trip, and therefore Eddard wouldn't be delivering the justice.
So I think it's important at some point in this conversation to go back and ask the question, are these peasants faking it? Now, I tend to lean towards believing these peasants. And it's not just because illiterate peasants who've spent their whole lives in the field tend to not be the best improv mummers. But it's also because the description does seem to fit in ice and fire world ravaging, and certain aspects even ring of Khal Drogo's pillaging of the Lazarene village. Additionally, to assume that Piper, Vance, and Derry could coordinate the rather large feat of making these peasants from very different villages all act appropriately and tell the same story is kind of a stretch in my mind. I think that if this were a plot by the young lords, they would have come alone so as to reduce the number of potential people slipping up in the tale. After all, illiterate peasants who've never left their village, let alone seen the king, are just as likely to slip up and say the wrong thing as they are to follow through on your carefully calculated act. Now, in his video, Preston Jacobs cites inconsistency in the peasants' tales as evidence that they are probably lying. However, such inconsistencies are actually quite common when it comes to traumatic and violent situations like this, in regards to how groups report back to authorities. If every peasant had shown up and told the exact same story, cookie-cutter catered, then I would be a lot more suspicious. Okay, so if the peasants aren't lying, and the raids themselves did happen, do we have anything else that might give us some information from the text? Well, kinda. There's an interesting conversation between Tyrion and Sir Kevan when he enters the Lannister camp after employing the help of the clans of the Mountains of the Moon. He tried a swallow of the ale. It was brown and yeasty, so thick you could almost chew it. Very fine, in truth. A pity his father had hanged the innkeep. "How's your war going?" His uncle answered. "Well enough for the nonce. Sir Edmure had scattered small troops of his men along his borders to stop our raiding, and your lord father and I were able to destroy most of them piecemeal before they could regroup." Sir Edmure had scattered small troops of his men along his borders to stop our raiding.
So what's going on here? Is Preston just wrong because the Lannisters are discussing these raids and therefore clearly Tywin did order them and the accusations against the Mountain are completely reasonable? That's a little hard to say. Sir Kevin just says raiding, and we don't know if this is follow-up raiding or if this is indeed the raiding that was being described when Eddard's justice was being given out. So we're left with kind of an impasse here. If this is the raiding that was being referred to when Eddard was giving out his justice, then I guess speculation is just flat out unwarranted here. We have an explanation. Tywin sent the raiders in to scatter Edmure's forces, and they then destroyed them piecemeal. Alternatively, though, because these are unspecified raids with unspecified leadership, these could be different raids. And we could be back in territory where it's reasonable to theorize that perhaps Tywin and Sir Gregor were not involved in these affairs. Or at least not involved in the initial raids. At this point, you're probably already asking, where the fuck is Littlefinger? Well, don't worry, I've got that finger on the button, or on the pulse. Some kind of joke about fingers. Because I think in either instance, we might be seeing hints of Littlefinger either playing as a background actor or outright orchestrating the entire affair. The War of the Five Kings is Littlefinger's chessboard, so let's examine how he might be moving the pieces here. Setting aside Sir Kevin's line, or simply assuming it's about other raiders, let's delve into the idea that the raids themselves were not ordered by the Lannisters. Well, jumping off from our previous video, which if you haven't seen you may want to go back and watch, involving Sir Hugh of the Vale. Analyzing the Sir Hugh situation, we can come to the conclusion pretty quickly that Littlefinger was basically the only person who could possibly have been manipulating the factors to lead to his death. The lack of incentive, motivation, or even the means to identify that Sir Hugh's gorget was undone kind of precludes the other players involved. And given that Sir Hugh's death is performatively used against Ned Stark, Littlefinger really is the only one with a strong motivation. Littlefinger describes to Sansa that the way you move people is to know what they want, essentially. Once you know what someone wants or what someone needs, you can then begin to manipulate them in the Game of Thrones. We learn in the series that Sir Gregor has a constant need for wealth, because he comes from a house that doesn't have a great deal of wealth to begin with. They were landed after feats performed by his grandfather in saving the Lord of Casterly Rock, but they were not wealthy to begin with. So Sir Gregor needs a consistent income, a stream of gold, to pay for his many needs and addictions. This means that he is in a prime position to be moved by Littlefinger, and I think this relatively easily explains why Sir Gregor would be the kind of piece that Littlefinger would be involved in moving. He needs the thing that Littlefinger can most easily create, gold. Or at least access to gold. And while Littlefinger's Midas touch might seemingly be an overused excuse for his powers and involvements in situations, in a world such as Ice and Fire, access to monetary power is second to none in many regards. So Littlefinger hired Sir Gregor to kill Sir Hugh, and has been supplying Sir Gregor with gold. How does this now translate into Littlefinger hiring him to commit the Riverlands raids? Well, if you've watched my previous videos, you know that Littlefinger is desperately attempting to keep the war within a very narrow scope. And we can actually see several of those actions play out in the courtroom scene, including when Littlefinger makes fun of Sir Loras, thus helping to drive Sir Loras away from the party that Ned is sending. Preston actually makes note of this fact in his own series on Littlefinger. This is one of many actions that Littlefinger has done to carefully keep the conflict between the Starks, Lannisters, and the Riverlanders who are sandwiched in between them. This is a long way to say that orchestrating the Riverlands raids leads to the type of war that Littlefinger wants to happen happening. It also has the added effect of weakening the Riverlanders' forces, thus leading to early Riverlander defeats. Again, Littlefinger wants the Riverlands to be overrun by the Lannisters, so this is part and parcel of the general scheme he has for the entire war. So maybe you're totally unconvinced by this wild rambling, and I understand that this is pretty shaky, but I think it's substantially less shaky than a House Dairy-related plot. And so while we're on this rickety foundation, I'm going to add one additional layer of tin coating to this whole debacle. Littlefinger is friends with people known as the Antler Men.
The antlermen are comprised of merchants and armorers and weapons manufacturers who live in King's Landing. It should be noted that even in the books, Lannister men are decked out in Lannister gear with lion-crested helms and Lannister doublets and all manner of stuff that implies that they work for House Lannister. However, the raiders are using unmarked gear, stuff that's unidentifiable even though much of it is mail and plate and gear designed for warfare, the kinds of things that average brigands don't generally have. However, again, it's unmarked, not stamped with any sort of Lannister markings. So you probably see where I'm going with all of this. Littlefinger could easily have armed Gregor and many of his lower foot soldiers, all of whom would be again called up to fight for House Lannister shortly, with this unmarked gear that he could acquire from the antlermen. It's then just a hop, skip, and a jump to letting somebody know that the antlermen were plotting against the Lannisters to get them executed and seal off that deal. And again, this is the crispy layer of tin around this already rickety house, but I like the idea of Littlefinger murdering people he uses, or rather getting them killed discreetly, so as to tie up a lot of loose ends. And I think the antlermen are an interesting, weird little, bizarre loose end that just kind of hang out there in the story. Okay, but what about that fat debunk that Kevin Lannister does on us? Surely us tinfoil theory nerds have to bow down to Big Chops Lannister and just admit that the raids were all part of this plan. And yeah, you're right. I actually am kind of, in my mind, a lot more leaning towards the idea that the muddledness of the situation is just George R. R. Martin writing, and that the real intention was for the plan Kevin to be describing to be the one that is, easily conceptualized and put forward, and it just didn't come across. And that said, I still think Littlefinger factors in quite easily. Again, Littlefinger is there in the room, seemingly taking a hand as to who Eddard might pick to send off on his justice. And he's doing it very subtly in his Littlefinger kind of way, his suggestive nature. But we should note that his influence does help Loras Tyrell not be able to go engage in this justice-giving. And obviously Loras Tyrell being killed by the Lannisters would have brought the Tyrells into the war rather rapidly. Instead, Ned Stark ends up sending basically all houses from the Stormlands and Crownlands. And on top of that, they're all relatively smaller houses, or at least houses that aren't dominant houses in their regions. Thus, they would have a lot harder of a time unifying a large army to march against the Lannisters to rectify any injustices. Furthermore, we know at this point that Littlefinger is working pretty detailedly with the Lannisters. Yes, he is absolutely manipulating them, but I think it's rather absurd to assume that Casterly Rock's only contact in King's Landing is Pycelle. And I think it's also foolish to assume that Cersei is acting completely outside of Littlefinger's influence when she's going through her whole decision to murder Robert Baratheon phase. We know Littlefinger is a hint dropper and a suggester, and we can see him very obviously dropping his little hints and suggestions and shaping the field of play. We view it in the courtroom, and I think there's reasonable chance to surmise that he's acting behind the curtains quite a bit. So I guess in conclusion, I think the fact that we can identify Littlefinger as having already carefully narrowed the scope of the war down to the Riverlands means that we can link him intimately into this initial raiding phase, be it that he's just semi-passively shaping it from the sidelines, or be it that he may actually be directly involved in orchestrating the raids himself. But, of course, as you can see by the tinfoil crown, this is one of these completely rickety theories that I'm putting forth, more just for fun and for interesting food for thought than anything else. I think it's more fun if we acknowledge that Preston is onto something, and that there are some weird inconsistencies with the start of the war and the fact that these raids are happening. However, I think those inconsistencies are Littlefinger inconsistencies. I think we're seeing his finger making ripples in the water. But who knows? So leave me your thoughts and comments below. Is Kevin Lannister right? Was this all a Tywin ploy and people have been misreading it? Is Preston right and I'm just a big fat idiot? Are we both wrong? Do you have a more interesting explanation that might add to this? Or maybe you just got some tidbits that you think might make the whole Littlefinger involvement make more sense. Let me know your thoughts and I'll try my best to respond. And as always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.